I would like to welcome you all to our webinar today that focuses on an international perspective to the energy transition. A little bit about AE2C. We are a nonprofit organization headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area with chapters in Massachusetts and Texas for now, and we hope that we will increase our presence in other states soon. AE2C connects the Pan-Asian community in the US and like-minded professionals to share knowledge, exchange dialogue, both nationally and internationally, and foster networking opportunities for all. Our Massachusetts chapter was launched last October, and we now have a Massachusetts-specific steering committee. If any of you are on the call today, you can put on your video now. Emily, Eva, Ramin, DeGuanto, and Aiden, who helped put this webinar together, along with our AE2C board members who are also here today. I will now introduce you to our moderator for today, Melita Elmore, who can then kickstart the panel. Melita Elmore has been a principal consultant in sustainability and an ISO lead auditor in energy, environment, health and safety, and labor and human rights compliance. She has worked in various industries and sectors like pharma, food and beverage, construction, power, generation, and chip manufacturing. She has also worked in federal and state regulatory agencies and was an executive for a Fortune 50 company for many years. With that note, we're delighted to have you, Melita, as our moderator for today. Thank you.
Thank you all. Welcome again. We're delighted that you're here. Just a couple of logistical issues to start, and then we will have the presentations from our three speakers who are incredible with their expertise and their knowledge of energy transition issues. If you would please mute yourself, and we are going to have the speakers speak first, 1, 2, 3. If there are any questions that come up during one of the speakers or 2 or 3 of the speakers, please feel free to just write them in the chat. At the end of the third presentation, we'll have time to read those questions. For those of you who are not endeared by chat, if you would like, at the end of the last presentation, you can turn your video back on if you've turned it off and raise your hand, and we'll unmute you and you can ask questions that way. So either by chat or at the end of the presentation, if you just like to raise your hand, either this way in video or the hand icon that's in Zoom, and we'll make sure we try to get to everyone's questions. I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers. They have an incredible array of expertise, and if I went through it all, the whole webinar would be me talking about these 3 speakers. So Emily is going to put in their more lengthy bios in the chat if you'd like to learn more about them. And of course, you can always go to the AE2C website to get more information about this webinar and upcoming events. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our speakers in the order that they're speaking. And again, they'll transition, and at the end, we'll open it up to questions. Our first speaker is going to be Preeti Bhandari. Preeti has over 33 years experience in environmental, climate change, sustainable development, and has worked on projects across Asia and in many other diverse multicultural organizations. Currently, she is the senior advisor in the Global Climate Program and Finance Center at the World Resource Institute. In this role, she provides strategic advice and guidance for the energy transformation by 2025. She's participated in the COPS initiatives, and she focuses particularly on issues of adaptation, resilience, loss, and damage. And she provides substantive inputs to supporting international climate action for just transition and climate finance. prior to being with WRI, she was the chief for climate change and disaster risk management at the Asian Development Bank. Our second speaker is Anun Subaya, and he is a principal at Synergy Consulting and an executive director at the McLean Development Group. For over 33 years, Anun has provided advisory services to the energy sector in about 50 countries, including Africa, Asia, the Pacific, Europe, North America, and South America. He has wide-ranging expertise in transactions and financial advisory, project finance, financial modeling, risk management, carbon finance, planning and policy, utility restructuring, tariff design, energy efficiency, and technology and energy market assessment. So he's pretty much done it all. He's also been a financial advisor for the development of infrastructure at the World Bank, and he advises donor agencies and banks like the USAID and the Asian Development Bank on issues in the energy transition. And our final speaker is Dr. Andy Sung, who is a tenured associate professor at MIT. He holds a professorship in the Sloan School of Management and MIT Energy Initiative, an electronic engineer by training. He's interested in building new bridges among the theory of optimization under uncertainty principles, distributed optimization, control of dynamic systems, developing fundamental understanding and new analytical tools for renewable energy integration, power grid optimization, stability and resiliency of interconnected energy systems and transportation systems. And his focus will be primarily on his most recent research that's been done in the US. So again, we are so delighted to have these speakers. And this is just indicative of the level of expertise that you will see in AE2C. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Preeti Bhandari. And again, then we'll transition to Anu and then to Andy, and then open it up for questions. So until then, please mute yourself and welcome to our speakers. Preeti, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Melita, and thank you for the introduction also. Let me also add my word of warm welcome to the participants to this webinar. This is my first outing with AE2C, so I'm not completely familiar with the background of the participants. So if some of you know the context at which I'm speaking, I'll request for your patience. But my topic for today, and if we can move to the next slide, please, is the broad international climate policy context for energy transition. And next slide, please. The broad climate policy framework actually started in 1992 formally with what is called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This actually is the fount of all the climate-related action that we are seeing decades down the road. And believe it or not, as Melita said, I've been 33 years in this field. So kind of started almost at the time the world was waking up to this particular challenge. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change actually set out the objective of stabilizing the greenhouse gases concentrations in the atmosphere, and also ensuring that the ecosystems adapt naturally and all actions lead to sustainable development. So that was the primary objective of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change way back in 1992. And as we moved on in the policy context, it was operationalized through what is called the Kyoto Protocol. And at that particular time, it was quite evident that it is the industrialized countries that have contributed a major share of emissions.
and a food coming by.
Could I request one of the participants has the audio on, if they could? Yes, thank you so much. So 1997 Kyoto Protocol, it was the operationalization of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and bulk of the onus of action on reducing emissions in that particular protocol was on industrialized countries and economies in transition, and they all set up a target of collectively reducing emissions from 1990 levels by about 5%, and in the period 2008 to 12. So, that was the beginning of the negotiations, the beginning of the developed country versus developing country responsibility, common but differentiated responsibility. But as things moved on globally, as economies matured or developed, there was an increasing push in the international policy space that the action has to be more universal. It has to involve everybody, all countries. And this led in 2015 to what is called the Paris Agreement, where the context actually changed to from concentrations and restriction of emissions to restricting the temperature increase above the pre-industrial levels to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So that was seen as the tipping point for natural systems, human systems, to not be able to cope with what climate change would wreak. So the transition went from stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations to reduction in emissions to having a temperature target. So that was the Paris Agreement, which led to, or which is expected to lead to an acceleration of efforts to reduce climate change and to ensure that the impacts are manageable, and hence the 1.5 degrees. And as Paris Agreement started getting operationalized, or the rule books got written for enacting the Paris Agreement, 2021 was an important year. And if I may stop here and tell you that what is referred to as COP, the Conference of the Parties, is nothing but all the 193 countries that have signed up to the Framework Convention and climate change, and they meet annually to discuss where the policy frameworks have evolved to, what actions need to be strengthened, enhanced, and what kind of support is required to enable this kind of an implementation framework. So Glasgow 2021 was COP26, 26 years of negotiations on climate change. And it was a clarion call, I would say, in terms of really pushing the frontiers on mitigation, and how mitigation, accelerated mitigation of greenhouse gases is critical. And from that perspective, in the Glasgow Pact, there was a very heavy, I would say, emphasis on transitions and energy transitions. And there were calls to accelerate adoption of policies to transition towards low energy systems, rapidly scale up deployment of renewable energy and clean energy, introduce energy efficiency measures at scale, and accelerate efforts to phase down unabated coal power plants. And this was a critical point in Glasgow, where some developing countries were negotiating on this word of phasing down versus phasing out. The original ambition was phasing out of all unabated coal power plants. But as political negotiations go, and I think India was critical in that dialogue to get the wording changed to phasing down based on the reality of coal dependency of many developing countries, especially many of the large developing countries. And of course, reference was made to fossil fuel subsidies and phasing them out as well. The interplay of climate politics and climate policy with the science world has also been quite evident over these decades. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a body of scientists and researchers who bring forth the evidence on climate change in a 6 to 7 year cycle. So this was the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was released in 2022. And of course, there were warning signals provided on how we are already on a course of a temperature increase of 1.1 degrees with all the emissions and stock of emissions that have been at play. And if the goal of 2 degrees or even the ambitious one of 1.5 degree has to be met, temperature increase has to be met, it needs imminent action at scale, action across the board, and deep emission cuts. And this warning by the IPCC in 2022 also put a lot of emphasis on transitions across all sectors, not only the energy sector, and it very clearly articulated that the continued installation of unabated fossil fuel infrastructure will lock in GHG emissions and put us on a path to over 3 degree temperature increase by the end of the century, by which point maybe life would be uninhabitable on the earth. So 2022, again, the COP, this body of intergovernmental negotiation space, at the end of 2022, there was, again, some kind of bartering and negotiations that were taking place. And again, India, which had watered down the language from phasing out of coal to phasing down of coal, brought in another aspect that why are we talking only about coal? Why aren't we talking about all fossil fuels? Of course, it did not get reflected in the eventual decision text, but that debate is still on. And just transition word was smattered all through the negotiated text. The fact that even though we are talking about transitions in various sectors and energy systems, this has to be just. And that particular aspect is really gaining ground, especially for countries which have to make these significant at-scale changes in their infrastructure. So come 2023, again, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has released its synthesis report, which is based on a synthesis of 3 reports or the tomes that it released in 2022. The first one is on the physical science basis, the atmospheric science basis, the evidence. The second one is related to adaptation and resilience. Given that we are already in a warming world, we need to adapt to the climate impacts, to the climate change that is taking place. So the second volume relates to adaptation and resilience, and the third one is on mitigation, and finally the synthesis report. And the synthesis report, again, very, very clearly gave the warning signals that if we continue in the current emission-intensive pathways, there is a chance that we will surpass 1.5 degrees between 2021 and 2040. So in the foreseeable future, we're not talking about even 2100 over here. And with that warning, it also behooved all countries to collectively peak emissions before the year 2025 and reduce them by almost half by 2030. So the next few years are critical for any kind of transitions that need to take place in energy and infrastructure sectors to be able to meet the goals that all countries agreed to in Paris. And in 2023, again, the international climate policy context at the end of, in November, not at the end of this year, but in November, countries are going to meet in Dubai, in UAE. And an important outcome from that particular meeting is going to be a stock take of where we are with what countries are doing, the commitments that they made in Paris, and what is the report card, but also moving forward, what needs to be done additionally to make sure that the 1.5 degree goal is met. So this is the broad policy context. If we could go to the next slide, please. And I will wrap up fast. So the debate, and you will hear from the next two speakers also on what is happening in various countries and various geographies. But the debate, given that there are various geopolitical considerations, given that, economic development are the primary goals of developing countries, given the paucity of finance and other political considerations. The debate is really about, has been shifting from phasing out coal to phasing down coal to phasing out all fossil fuels. So this is the debate which is rife. Of course, countries at the country level are doing what they can within their means, but in the international policy context, what is the support? What are the means of implementation that developing countries can be supported with is a moot point. And related to that, one of the critical means of implementation is finance. And in the climate policy context, developed countries had made a commitment to provide $100 billion to developing countries by 2020 to enable climate action, both mitigation and adaptation to finance. That goal has not been met. The goalpost has been shifted to 2023, but that gives you also the contentious context within which all countries are taking action. Given that climate finance goals have not been met, there is already talk about transition finance, which is transition finance is generally understood to help decarbonize entities or economic activities that are emissions intensive, may not currently have a substitute, or are important for future socio-economic development. Melita, I'll take just 2 more minutes to go through this.
Of course.
And as I said earlier, the talk of transitions in sectors in the energy sector has now an added element of just transition. So how do you ensure that greening the economy is fair, inclusive, and provides decent work opportunities and no one is left behind? So that element has been added to the transitions. And we already have Just Energy Transition Partnership in South Africa. There have been recent agreements with Indonesia and Vietnam, but some of the major economies are being provided support financially by developed countries through what is called the JETPs, or Just Energy Transition Partnerships. And more recently, the group of 7 countries have also introduced something what is called the climate clubs, which is to enable sectors in emissions intensive sectors in developing countries to make a transition. And for that, they have to sign up to what is called the climate clubs. So I would end by saying that the onus of action is on the group of 7 countries, the rich developed countries, but also on G20 countries, which includes large emerging economies, which are fast moving on their development path, but with a high emissions footprint. And how these 2 groupings come together to help reduce emissions would be critical in the next few years. As I said earlier, by 2030, the emissions have to be reduced by 43% to keep the hope of 1.5 degree goal alive. Thank you. I'll stop there. Thank you, Melita.
Thank you so much. My goodness, that was wonderful. And perhaps we can bring you back after you've attended Dubai. I know looking at the last two IPCC reports, engineers and scientists tend to be pretty even keel. So the fact that they are raising the alarm, I think, is significant. You also mentioned the phasing out or phasing down of coal, which is a great segue to our next speaker. Nun is going to be speaking on the transition from coal plants to renewables in Asian countries. And so now we're going from the policy aspect to what is actually happening practically on the ground. So I will go ahead and turn it over to you. Anu, if you want to go ahead, and there you are. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Melita. Thanks for the introduction. A very warm welcome to all the participants. I'm also a board member of AE2C, and I've been associated with them for the past several years. So I'm very happy to participate in this webinar and also see so many new participants. So welcome to everyone. So over the next 10-15 minutes, I want to talk a little bit about coal transition and what does it mean and what does it entail. Preeti has very nicely provided the backdrop of why this transition needs to take place. And she mentioned the Glasgow Pact, where transitioning from coal was much debated, and it was agreed that it needs to be done. And while we see the need, we also recognize that there's going to be an enormous challenge. Globally, about 35% of all power generation is from coal. And so that's a large number. Now, if you look at the developing and emerging economies, there it's perhaps 45, 50%. Some countries have more, some have less. So as you know, China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, South Africa, these are countries which burn an enormous amount of coal, as does Germany or the US for that matter, but the proportion of coal use is even higher in these emerging countries. And with that comes the challenge of how do you transition out of it and how do you supplant all that coal capacity with renewable? And it's not going to be easy. It's pretty complex. There are issues related to energy security, the stability of the grid, meeting the basic demands of people. So there are many, many challenges. And then, of course, the biggest challenge is all the socioeconomic costs of making that transition. Some of you might recall many, many years ago when the UK first privatized its coal mines, there was during the Thatcher years, it was a big riot in the country because it changed the landscape of the country. And that's been happening since then in many, many countries. And here in the US, it's a big debate. If someone talks about phasing out coal, politically, it's a very difficult issue to address. And so this is mirrored in every country, whether it's Poland or whether it's India or China or Vietnam, Indonesia. The socio-economic impact of transitioning from coal is enormous. And that challenge is perhaps harder to surmount than the technical and financial problems of transitioning from coal. So I will talk about three key issues today. One is, how do you select these coal plants? I mean, what are the key criteria? And having selected them, what do you want to do with them? How do you repurpose it? What are the options? What is the strategy? And then what kind of financing mechanisms are required to make that transition happen? And that's the most complex part because there's no clear definition of how much money is needed. It's not as simple as decommissioning a plant and putting up something new there. So we'll talk briefly about each of those things over the next 10 odd minutes. So in terms of criteria for replacing a coal plant, as you can readily imagine, there are purely technical and commercial criteria. Technical criteria, if a plant is old, it's very likely it's using older technology, older combustion technology, older boilers, which are not, operating at supercritical or ultra-critical temperatures. And so they have lower heat rates, they have lower efficiencies, and are not always operational. So in a sense, their load factors or plant load factors, as we call it, is low. So these are obvious targets for replacement. So if a plant has been put up only in the last 5 years, it's not an obvious target. I mean, just to give you a sense, on average, I think globally, coal power plants last 35, 40 years. They can last longer, but in many countries, they're shut down and mothballed before that. But if a plant's been put up in the last 5, 10 years, then obviously it's going to be very cost prohibitive to mothball it and transition to something else, though it can be done if enough money is thrown at these things. But so that age and all these technical criteria are very critical. Commercially, one has to look at what kind of contractual obligations are there. Many power plants, whether they're fossil fuel based or renewable energy based, are project financed. And so they are financed on the basis of a long-term power purchase agreement. So there is a seller who has agreed or who's obliged to purchase this power from this power plant. That's the basis and the revenue projections on the basis of which the plant's been financed. So if there's a 30-year PPA and you only got through like 15 of those years, then you have to make the buyer of the PPA, who has 15 more years, whole. Equally, you have debt from commercial banks or from DFIs or other sources of financing, and you have to pay off that debt ahead of getting your revenues. So those criteria, the commercial and financial criteria, become very, very critical apart from just the technical criteria. Then there are regulatory criteria. I mean, there's increasingly new kinds of regulation, whether it's related to pollution, air pollution, water pollution. Are these plants able to meet those new compliance requirements? What is the cost of meeting the compliance, or cost of compliance? And are there instances where the cost is low of exiting these obligations? If the cost is low, then also it's a good target. So these are kinds of considerations which play into identifying power plants. And later I'll talk about a few examples where this has been done. Additionally, there are environmental and social considerations. So the environmental one, as I mentioned, are easy: water pollution, air pollution, emissions. So those are taken into consideration. But social criteria are the most challenging, because the social impacts, as I said in my introduction, are wide-ranging. There are many, many stakeholders. It's not just the owners of the power plants and the people using the power. The people in the coal mines who mine this coal, the people who then rake it onto railway rakes, and then the people who load it onto other forms of transport, the use in power plants, and the communities in those mining towns and near coal plants which depend on this. It's a large number compared to clean energy or even to other fossil fuels such as natural gas. Coal has wide-ranging social impacts, some positive for the communities, but obviously negative from a climate standpoint. So one has to engage with a very wide range of stakeholders if one has to decommission a coal power plant. You have to get the buy-in of these wide range of stakeholders if one has to succeed, and that's very key. It's not just to keep everyone happy, but because a lot is at stake for these people, and that becomes harder. And it's also very topical, because each country will have a different situation which has to be addressed, and the opportunities for those people will also be different in different economies. So that has to be considered very carefully. I want to next talk about the strategy for what do you do with these. Let us say you have identified the plant, now you want to transition it out. What do you do with it? Obviously, you can reuse some of the parts. You can reuse the power, you can use the boilers. These are plants where there are substations, there are transmission lines. So there's a lot of advantage to have some kind of clean energy project going on there, whether it's a solar plant, a wind plant, depending on land available. You could put a battery storage plant there. You could put a hydrogen plant, ammonia plant, and all these are not hypothetical. They're all been examined in detail. You could also do something non-energy related. You could reforest the place or put it to commercial use after adequate remediation. So there are many options, but again, it all depends on what is the financial and social impact of doing that, and that is what decides what you can do with this coal plant or with a coal mine once you decommission it or decide to decommission it. How do you use it? Coal mines at least have a lot of land, so you could put up clean energy plants there, but coal power plants don't necessarily have as much land as a solar plant or wind plant need. In fact, they need much more land on an acre per megawatt basis than a coal plant does. So one has to take all these considerations before deciding on the best strategy, which is technically feasible and is going to be cost effective. I will quickly transition to now what kind of financing mechanisms are there and how will this be financed. The cost is enormous. So when one looks at financial viability, one has to look at, like I said, if you have left a power purchase agreement on the table, and now you want to put up a new power plant, which also requires a power purchase agreement, what kind of revenue stream was left which you have to pay out? What kind of new revenue streams do you expect from the new plant? Will it be viable to put that up? What will be the impact on other contractual parties, the people who supply fuel, people who supply a kind of equipment and materials, and on the wider community? But most importantly, someone then has to pay the cost. And who's that? It's generally us, the customer, right? Who, the electricity consumer. We might talk about transition, but eventually it has to be paid by the consumer either as a tariff or paid by governments as subsidy, which again is paid from taxpayers' money. So someone has to bear that cost. So we have to be very careful in deciding which plants should transition and how to transition them. And as I mentioned, the bigger cost there is the social and economic cost. And so that becomes even more tricky. But despite that, there are some scalable financing mechanisms which have been tried out in various countries, which could help with this transition. And I'll give you only a couple examples before Melita, I'll just take a couple minutes. So say, for example, you're a rich country like Germany, and you have a population which is very willing to bear the cost of transition. Then there are greater options because you can use public money to enable this transition. In fact, Germany has an act, a legislative act through which it phases out coal power plants and it pays out. So there's an auction process where power plants bid and ask for money for compensation to shut down their coal plant and move to other forms of production. And so that's been very successful in Germany. I mean, initially when it started in like 2020 or so, I think they were paying out about 67,000 euros per megawatt to phase out a plant. And now last year, I think it was down to about 55,000 per megawatt. But that's Germany. Now, if one has to shut down all the lignite plants there and exit all of that, some estimates say that you'd need about $55 billion, and that's Germany alone. So if you look at larger countries like India, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, South Africa, which use a lot of coal, the cost is enormous. So in these other countries, one will have to depend on some form of concessional financing from the DFIs and some kind of support, as Preeti mentioned, from from developed countries. And the DFIs have been very active. Preeti used to be with ADB, as she mentioned, and the ADB has what it calls an energy transition mechanism initiative, under which it's trying to leverage financing for countries and is taking a portfolio approach. So it's not saying, let's go and replace this one power plant with something else. It has a lending portfolio where it has several coal plants, which it has supported in the past. And so it's trying to see if it can take a portfolio approach to helping countries transition out of coal. And it's trying this out in Indonesia and also in Vietnam and other places where it's been active. So that could be one way of doing it. Chile in South America has a lot of private power plants, the big ones, the European companies like Engie and Enel and American companies like AES have agreed to decommission some of their coal plants and move towards renewable energy. And the Inter-American Development Bank is providing some kind of concessional financing by monetizing the potential GHG abatement from this shift. And so they are able to monetize that, securitize that, and try and provide concessional financing. So there are some very innovative things being done, but in the long term, sustainability will require other kinds of sustainability bonds, carbon markets, and all of these things to come play because the cost is enormous and public money won't be able to do it. And most importantly, one will have to address the social cost. And that cost could be far more in some countries than in others. I think I'll stop there and turn it back to Melinda.
It's fascinating, the public financing and private financing. For those of you who joined late, we'll have our last speaker. If you have any questions that come up for any of our speakers, please put them in the chat. We'll also give you a time at the end to verbally ask questions if you prefer. Again, this is a nice segue as we kind of pull these questions back to home, back to the US. We've heard what other countries are doing, specifically in Asia, an overview of what's happening on a macro level. And now we're going to hear about, and which is perfect timing because the White House just recently put out their fact sheet on the budget for combating climate change and having environmental justice and lowering energy costs. So Andy's now going to talk about decarbonization and optimization of the US power grids. Andy, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melita. Thank you for inviting me onto this panel. Really honored to be here with the two distinguished panelists and already learned a lot from their talk. So I'm going to talk briefly about decarbonization of the US power grid. I think overall the message that I want to convey is the US power grid urgently needs modernization and decarbonization. As I will show in a few minutes, we're talking about 10 times more renewables and much more expanded transmission systems that need to be built in the next 10, 20 years. As Preeti and Anu already mentioned, this is a daunting task and very complicated task. And but we also have good news. The good news is we have resources, I think. First, the US is blessed with abundance of resources. As I'll show you, we have absolutely sufficient wind and solar resources ready to be used for the transition into a renewable dominant system. And second, if you also look at the economic benefits of a renewable dominant modernized power grid, it's also enormous. We do need to invest enormous amount to modernize and decarbonize our grid. But if you look at the benefit side, I think the cost pales comparing to that. And not to mention that we need to, as Preeti mentioned, to mitigate global warming. That's the main goal here. So next slide, please. So this is a quick show of the evolution of the US power generation mix in the past 70 years. As you can see from here, since around mid-2000s, the US power grid got into a phase of rapid change with quickly declining coal, which is the black part, and fast increasing of natural gas power generation, and also quick increase of renewables. Next slide, please. So if we zoom into the renewable part, we're talking about hydropower, wind, solar, biomass, and geothermal. And from this graph, similar period of 70 years in the US, the hydro roughly stays constant in the past 30 years. And what we can see has been changing fast is we all know this big change of increase of renewable, especially wind and solar, especially wind in the past 10 years, 20 years. So next slide, please. Where we are now is showing in this picture. If we think about this is 2020, the US in total generated about 4,000 billion kilowatt hour of electric energy. And if you think about this is a big pie, then this pie has about 5 pieces. So 2 pieces are generated by natural gas powered units, which is in the pink line here is the tallest. And 1 piece from coal. So about 20% of electricity generated by coal in the US last year. And the remaining 2 pieces are shared by nuclear, wind, hydro, solar, a little bit of biomass, and geothermal. And nuclear and hydro have stayed roughly constant in the past 30 years, and will likely keep roughly constant moving into the near future. Then the growth to decarbonize the power grid falls to decommissioning fossil fuel generators, and at the same time growing wind and solar. And as Anu already talked a lot about the complications of decommissioning fossil fuel generators, especially coal power plant, we're going to talk more about how much wind and solar do we need. Next slide, please. So here is a very simple my backup envelope calculation. So if we consider a US system reaching a level of 90% clean power grid, meaning 90% of electric energy generated from nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, biomass, and geothermal. From the previous slide, we see that at 2022, we are around 40% level of clean power, 18% nuclear, and then 22% hydro, wind, and solar. Okay. So we're talking about going from this 40% level to 90% level in the next 20 years, say. How to do that, right? How much renewables do we need in order to do this? There are many studies and pathways that we could reach to a 90% clean power grid. And there are a lot of also questions, technical questions in terms of if we could actually operate such a high renewable system to maintain the same level of reliability, stability of the grid, what is needed? If we just take sort of simplified or simplistic view, which roughly based on some of the current standard of, say, retaining the nuclear power and hydropower at the current level, decommissioning the fossil fuels, and there are many different choices and options. If you think about decommissioning to about 10% of natural gas generation and retire almost all coal, and we think about 2% of load annual growth, which is roughly the right level, at least in the past 10 years. And we also want to consider electrifying other things, transportation, heating, industrial processes. These will add to the load increase as well, electric load, but they're not going to be dramatic, at least in the next 10, 20 years. So we also need to consider, wind and solar, these are stochastic resources. They're not always on, they're intermittent and stochastic. So if we also consider their capacity factor and everything, roughly we'll need around 1,200 gigawatts of new renewables. Of course, this is backup envelope calculation. It also sort of matches some of the more sophisticated studies. We also are doing more sort of modeling-based studies of this. 1,200 gigawatt of new renewables means around 800 gigawatt of wind, 360 gigawatt of solar. So how does it compare with what we have now? This is about 6 to 7 times more wind and solar from what we have today. I know there's a lot of complications and going into the costs of how to finance this, and we have 2 experts here in the panel. If we just consider, roughly $1 to $3 per watt of sort of capacity cost of building new wind and solar power plant. Of course, this cost will also change over time. We're talking about around $2 to $3 trillion investment, right? So this is, of course, this is a very high level sort of picture of what we are talking about. So is this a lot to expect in both terms of natural resources available and also financial resources available? Roughly speaking, if you think about US GDP in 2021, it's around $23 trillion. We're talking about maybe a little bit more than 10% of US GDP spent in building new renewables. These are just about renewable generation, spread out over 10, 20, more years. What about natural resources? If you go to the next slide. So this is a study that we did recently about Texas. So there are already very careful study available mapping out available wind and solar resources around the US continent. So so here is the Texas. We consider site suitability, land use restrictions applied to the available wind and solar available sources on the left 2 figures, and map them to the electric grid, around 2,000 buses or electric nodes in the Texas grid. Then that's on the right. So we can see that the total available capacity of wind and solar, even in Texas alone, is way more than what we were talking about, 1,200 gigawatts of total. We have around 1,200 gigawatts of wind alone and 20 gigawatt of solar. That's the sort of the resource abundancy that we're talking about that could be tapped and used to generate renewable energy. So I think I have a few more minutes. So this is about how much resources we have. We recently did a study on Texas and also West Interconnection, look at their decarbonization process. So we have some sort of high level findings. First, in Texas, as we are building up the renewables, as we know, they are stochastic, they are intermittent. It's still quite difficult to forecast them even day ahead. So in order to operate such a high level renewable system, we do need significant energy storage resources. And there is quite a bit of activity, investments and building up the energy storage in ERCOT. We do need a lot more. But the interesting finding is also how much we need in terms of energy storage, in terms of solar and wind, really depends also on other factors, such as how much transmission expansion that we can build, meaning how much more of a transmission capacity we can build into our system. So we all know it's really hard, takes a lot of time to permit building new transmission lines. We can also think about better utilizing our transmission system and enlarging the current line capacity. So question is that going to pay off? And according to our very preliminary results, and also I think it's widely sort of acknowledged, is transmission expansion really would pay off in terms of, it will add about, in terms of Texas, around 1.4% of investment cost. But it will save around 7% in terms of total investment costs, meaning if it's invest transmission expansion, then we don't need to invest that much in solar and storage. And also will decrease 50% of the operational cost. So it's really sort of a leverage or multiplier effect from transmission side. And interestingly, if you look at other parts of the US, for example, Western Interconnection, what we found is over there, the the need for storage is actually much lower than what happened in Texas. It could, these two systems are very different. They have very different load profiles, very different spatial distributions, and also different generation profile. For example, Western Interconnection has a lot more hydropower. So all these factors need to be considered, and they do make a difference in terms of what would be a good way to decarbonize the system. Of course, there are also a lot more other questions, as Anand was mentioning, a social cost of decarbonization and how to transition communities from fossil fuel-based communities to renewable-based communities. I think these are all very challenging questions. But as we all agree, I think moving forward, decarbonizing the power system and also gradually decarbonizing other systems as well, like electrification of transportation, agriculture, decarbonization, and these are all very, very important. So I think there will be a much more coupling between power grid and other systems that traditionally are much more separated and decoupled. So we're already seeing this sort of coupling coming into play with the resiliency of the system, reliability of the power grid. If one system fails, then the other system may also experience large disturbance. So I think there are also a lot of challenging questions moving forward with how to maintain resiliency and reliability in a very different world in terms of the energy system that we're going to have.
Thank you, Andy. So that's so true. As someone who survived the snowstorm 2 Februaries ago when the Texas power grid went out, I really appreciate you talking about the different variances of the power grids. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to just put in any questions in chat. Emily Chang, who is on the steering committee for the Massachusetts chapter, will be reading out the questions. I'm going to ask all three speakers if you would please put your videos on so that we can see you when you're addressed. And if you wouldn't mind, try to hold your answers down to a couple of minutes. That may not be possible, but we're going to try. And as you're putting your questions in, it reminded me of a couple of years ago, I did an energy audit for a large pharma and pharma equipment manufacturing plant in Brazil. And I was looking at their scope 2, which is their electricity provider as part of their life cycle assessment. And it was the first audit of many, many audits that I had done that was total renewable energy. It was solar and wind and hydro. And I don't know why, but it just excited me. So I love that all of the speakers kind of pulled this together. And with that, Emily, why don't you see what questions we have? And hopefully we can take them for about 10 minutes and then have a closing and let you all go. So thank you again to our speakers. Emily?
So the first question that came through is someone's curious to know where we stand globally and locally in the US on hydrogen gas, especially using hydrogen for the transportation sector. Who would like to address that? All of you? Or we start with Andy.
Maybe Anand, I think, want to go first.
I don't have a clear answer. I work on hydrogen issues, but I can't specifically answer where we are in the US. There are a lot of efforts being made to tap hydrogen of every color, from green hydrogen to gray to blue, and other colors in the spectrum. And these are all important and needed. But I think Europe is making greater strides in this. They're also looking at natural hydrogen in situ, which can be tapped. Countries, India, for example, has a hydrogen policy where it wants to produce a lot of renewable energy and move towards hydrogen or ammonia production. And other countries are doing it, but I don't have a clear number for you as to where we stand. Perhaps Andy, if you have your research something.
I haven't done much research in hydrogen side, but I know there's a lot of activities going on in terms of building up infrastructure. I think, I mean, there's some rough numbers. the rounds, still, I think it's in a very preliminary stage. I see some numbers like 50 US fuel stations provide hydrogen to support, around, there are also hydrogen fuel cell powered vehicles. So there are around 10,000 hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And also, there are hydrogen buses, which not that many right now, but things are developing.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Anand. Folks, don't be shy. If you would like to come off mute and raise your hand, I'm happy to call on you. Otherwise, we have some questions that people have pre-submitted, and I can ask those. So I'll just give everybody a minute to not be shy and come off mute, or put some more questions in the chat. Here's one. So someone asked,
Emily, somebody
Yes.
has raised their hand.
okay, fantastic.
Gaurav, can you go ahead and speak up your question?
Yeah, hi. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I think this question is for you, Andy. We in media and in other through online networks, we hear a lot about energy companies and the transportation sector in terms of electrifying. We don't hear much about the industrial sector.
Yeah.
At least, and that's use our source in the world using fossil fuels. Could you provide some color around that? At least for my benefit, because I'm usually very curious to know how we are going to meet the net zero targets, be in the public sector, private sector, or what you have. But I don't get to get so much information about the industrial sector. Everybody talks about cars, electric cars, natural gas, oil, whatnot, but industrial sector is one of the one sector which uses it, and I'm sure it's very crucial to meet the net zero targets.
Right. Yeah, definitely crucial. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think I would I can definitely advertise MIT Energy Initiative in terms of there are a lot of ongoing research actually in decarbonizing industrial processes in terms of fuel change from fossil fuel to hydrogen, for example, or other ways to decarbonize very heavy emission industries like steel, cement production. These are all very important sources of emission. Yeah, I think I can definitely connect you to those researchers that are doing this kind of research. I think a lot more definitely need to be done. Also, in terms of the interaction with the power grid, I would say those industrial processes could also, and they're already doing, for example, a lot of demand response to, help the grid at the same time as a resource of helping grid operation.
On video in a moment, okay?
Thank you, Andy.
And I just have a follow-up, Emily, if it's okay for Andy.
Oh, sure.
So Andy, just a follow-up to that is,
Sure.
Will there be industries in the world that would always need fossil fuels?
I think there are many industries. I'm not the expert here. I think whenever the industry that really need combustion, really high density energy, that's where it's hard to decarbonize them. So I think I don't know if it absolutely needs fossil fuel as a fuel. There's definitely a question of trade-off of how much cost of using other fuels. I don't know other Anand and Kriti have maybe more experience in terms of there's.
Yeah, let's maybe go to
Yeah.
another question because we do have quite a few.
Yeah.
Emily, do you want to read out one
Yep.
of the questions?
So this
Thank you.
question is directed to Preeti. The West had committed to send funds over to the global South and other developing countries as part of the Paris Agreement. Now, the person says, I've not been able to verify what actually happened to the money or how much was actually ever sent. And I'm curious to know how the global financial system can be utilized to instill trust.
Thank you, Kashif. That's a very important question. You know, it is the money that makes the world go around. And in terms of building trust, that 100 billion promise for getting developing countries to sign up to climate action, you know, making universal this climate commitments, 100 billion was part of that promise that we will support you. And of the 100 billion, as things stand, the report card is about 83 billion has been provided. Of course, there is contention on what has been counted and what, you know, how effective that funding has been. But at least as the numerical quantitative number goes, 83 billion, much of that has gone for mitigation, and only 20 billion has gone for adaptation. So there are these conversations taking place about you know, how effective, A, on the quantum, B, on how effective this financing has been. And what is important is, as Anand said earlier, you know, this is all public funding, but the needs are in trillions, not in billions. And to what extent a part of that commitment was also to mobilize private sector, use innovative sources of financing. And unfortunately, on that account, things have been not that rosy. But even with public funding, the commitment hasn't been met. And you're absolutely right. This is a question of trust moving forward. The trust in the system is quite low at this particular point in time, but there are certain rays of hope, like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, you know, the commitment to double financing for adaptation, and of course, conversations and negotiations are on a new climate finance goal starting 2025. But that trust deficit definitely is a question that is derailing some of these conversations.
Thank you so much for the answer. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you to all of our speakers. I wish we had more time because there's a lot more questions, but let me go ahead and turn it over to one of our favorite AE2C board members, co-founder and president Bob G., who will go ahead and say some closing remarks and tell you more about this great organization for those of you who aren't a member yet. And you can always go to the website to see what other kind of great events that were happening that are of this caliber that you saw today. So again, our sincere thanks to all of the speakers. And Bob, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Melita. I want to extend a very heartfelt thanks to the organizers of our webinar this afternoon, especially to Pooja and her team in Massachusetts. Those of you in our new Massachusetts chapter, thank you so much for putting this together. And to you, Melita, our moderator, and to our speakers, Preeti, Anand, and Andy, thank you so much for this information-rich and informative discussion on this very important topic of energy transition from our legacy resources to sustainable resources. This is the conversation that is at the very center of our energy policy today, both globally, nationally, and subnationally, and it's not going to go away. It's going to be with us for the rest of our lives. You did a great job in providing an overview of the issue set and identifying the challenges that we have us today, so thank you so much. I do want to mention that, as was mentioned earlier in our webinar, we do have this tremendously new chapter that we launched in last October in Massachusetts. So for those of you who live in the Boston and Massachusetts area, please feel free to sign up to AE2C and engage in our activities in our Massachusetts chapter. This is the first of what I know will be many activities coming from that chapter. I do understand that they are planning an in-person event for later this year. So please be in touch with Pooja and her team for more information. For those of you who are based in our Washington, D.C. Region, we do have an event coming up next month to celebrate AAPI Heritage Month. It will be an in-person event as well as a virtual event at the offices of the Edison Electric Institute in downtown Washington on May 24th at 4 p.m. We will feature a symposium with a panel of seasoned Asian American energy professionals to share with you their life stories about their professional careers, the milestones and challenges that they faced, and to be able to take questions. And for those of you who are not situated physically or live in the DC area, please know that this program will also be live streamed and be offered to our members as well. I am reminded by Jenny Howe that much of our program content will be subscriber available. So that's my last pitch to you, which is please do join AE2C if you're not already a member. Go to our website, ae2c.org, join AE2C, be able to access all of our content, not only our webinars such as this, but also our future content that we'll be making available. And with that, I want to thank once again Pooja for putting this and her team of Massachusetts for pulling this together, and to our speakers and our moderator. Thank you so much for being with us today. I don't know if I'm supposed to hand this off to anybody. Should I hand this back to you, Pooja? Do you want to make some closing remarks since you kicked us off? If so, please feel free to take the microphone. Thank you so much.
I think that's perfect and a great ending. Thanks everyone, and we'll
thank you to our sponsor. We want to thank our sponsor.
Yes.
Right, Eversource. And there's one question that's on the chat that we could not address. We will put that question, the answer to that question soon.
Let me also give a big thanks to Eversource, our sponsor, which reminds me to tell everybody on our call, the cost of putting on these programs is let's just say, is for this particular webinar, this is free, obviously. And I understand this particular content will be accessible for free on our website, but we cannot continue to produce this type of high quality content without underwriters. So for those of you who know of sources of underwriting who can help direct them in our direction, we would be most grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the week. Thank you again. Everyone stay safe. Bye.
Thank you.